Hey there, my name is Shane Craddock, and this is the Inner Edge podcast, where I share a different take on how to lead and live a sustainable, high performance life. Over the course of different episodes, I'm going to challenge the belief that tension, stress, and struggle are essential to success and creativity. My experience is that there's an easier way, there's a better way, and indeed there's an essential way that we need to explore for the times that we live in. So let's go ahead, let's jump in and explore. Hello there, and welcome to today's episode with myself, Shane Craddock. This is The Inner Edge, and today's title is Your Story and Self-Esteem. And I suppose it struck me recently, I love story myself. I'm a big fan of writing, of narration. I've studied story as a writer for fun. I've written a couple of plays, both of which got made. I've written a couple of screenplays, none of which got made, but I'm just really into story. But also because of my work, especially with individuals and then with teams and groups, it's always interesting to me. You're trying to figure out what's the story that this group, and in particular, what's the story that the leader is telling themselves, because the story will change hugely depending on sometimes their state, their mood, sometimes their circumstances. And whatever the story is that they're telling themselves has a massive impact on their self-esteem. And your self-esteem is a critical variable, really, in terms of success in whatever field you're in. Strong self-esteem, you'll take the hits, you'll think big, you'll be confident. It really is something that is, I think, critical. But I'm not sure everyone sees it the same way. So I just want to explore that, maybe some food for thought today with you. Before I get into that, there's two things I want to talk about. One is I'm doing a new survey for the first time called, it's a survey on inner leadership. And I'm leaving it open until Friday, the 8th of March, 2024. Recording this just before that. So leave it open for a few days, about a week before that. So the 8th of March is when it's finished, but there's a link in this podcast somewhere, wherever you're getting it. And it's just a series of questions for your leader, particularly if you're a business owner, CEO, C-suite. I'd be interested in your thoughts and comments on the inner game of leadership in work and in life. Second thing is, I'm organizing some talks around my homeland of Ireland over the coming months. There's one coming up in Galway in April. There's a link to that talk just in case you're based in Galway or close to it. It might be of interest in a place called the PorterShed, very interesting workspace with a lot of different entrepreneurial companies. So back to this and back to today. Your story and self-esteem. So just go back. Your self-esteem, to me, is hugely dependent on the story that you're telling yourself. So self-esteem, critical variable for resilience and navigating life successfully. But it's hugely dependent on the story you're telling yourself. So the question then is, what story are you telling yourself? And very often that story, like there might be a story that I'm telling myself today that's front of mind. And that's worth reflecting on, because it does change depending on the day or the week or the month or the year in terms of what's going on around you. But also then there's kind of this fixed story that's often unconscious at the back of your mind that has maybe a bigger bearing on what happens to you in your life. Now, I talk about this in different ways in my book, The Inner CEO. One of the things I talk about in the book is the metaphor that your mind is like a projector. If you think about the movie projector. So you go to the movie because you're watching a story, and as humans, we love nothing better than a great, compelling story. Well, we don't always think that our story is perhaps the most compelling. We're fascinated with our own stories without realizing it. But if your mind's like a projector, what that means, one aspect of the projector is that you're always playing stories in your mind. Now, the story could be about somebody that you know in your life. Well, they're out to get me, or they're supporting me, or I love them, or I don't love them. Your projector will be about the day ahead, the week ahead, the job you're in, the business you're in, the industry you're in, the projections for the coming year. Somebody asked me recently, what's my view of trends in the economy in Ireland and globally? And I was just reflecting, that's interesting. Everyone talks about it, but nobody can really predict the future, even though we often think we do. But by listening, from my point of view, I had an answer to the question. Because I'm working in different industries. And so I have a story to tell about what I think the future is. but that doesn't mean it's true. But it does affect how I feel about the future. Now, in relation to your self-esteem in particular, I think your story will do one of three things. First of all, it could build narcissism. So if your story is almost overconfidence or I'm invincible or it's all about me, then it will build narcissism, which is obviously dangerous. The second thing it could do is your story could grow unhealthy low self-esteem, which is what we don't want, but actually it's all too common. I think it's more common than perhaps you might realize. I see it all the time. And even though people mightn't necessarily, I mightn't say it to a client, but I might recognize it because people can be very sensitive to being told, understandably, that maybe they have unhealthy low self-esteem. Whereas the third thing that your story will do is it perhaps supports a healthy, balanced self-esteem, which is obviously where I'm going to point the arrow. Now, if it's low, as I said, I think it happens to quite a lot of people. And your mind, your inner voice story could be a version of I'm not good enough. And I've certainly had that in my lifetime. If my mood drops low enough, my inner voice can kind of go in that direction. I'm always aware that it might do that, especially if my mood drops. But I've had to work over time and understand, well, how do you build your self-esteem if it's in that category? And in my book, The Inner CEO, I also share a story about a client who was absolutely adamant that they were shockingly bad at maths. So you could say in that context, her self-esteem was just very poor in relation to numbers or maths. And so that reflected though in her business and it was a problem. And we just had to take it on because ultimately it wasn't true. Although she was absolutely adamant because of her story, which came all the way back to being a child in a schoolroom where the teacher said, you're terrible at maths, and kept on reinforcing that point. And the child, my client, when she was very young, I think it was probably around 7 or 8, then that just stuck. And then she built a story around that, which rippled out into adulthood. Now, luckily, we were able to catch it, and she was able to challenge that story, challenge that narration, and change it to actually, if I put in the time, I'm really good at numbers. I like numbers. And now she loves maths, she loves numbers, and actually a good part of her job and what she does in her role is a huge amount of time with numbers and accounts, which would have seemed absolutely impossible at the time. But again, from challenging her story, which impacted on her self-esteem in relation to a particular subject. Obviously, I've shared before in this podcast about having a very serious depression period in my life, in my mid-20s. But my story at that time, looking back, I didn't know it really at the time. It took me a while to figure out, to see it, identify it. Was my story was very much that of I'm a loser. I can't cope. My life isn't really worth anything. People would be better off if I wasn't here. Like terrible stuff. Again, that's bringing your self-esteem down because the movie projector then plays this story. And for me, it was absolutely unconscious. I didn't realize the extent of how bad it was. And of course, then whatever you're thinking in your mind, you feel. And then your self-esteem is just, if you think about it like a deposit account in a bank, it's just you're making withdrawals all the time. Every time you're bringing in a version of certainly I was in terms of a loser story. Or I remember talking to a client, a woman, very smart, balanced, successful woman who would kind of joke with me and she'd say, yeah, look, I'm good at business, but I'm a crap mum. And she was joking, but she was still a little bit serious, and a little bit of scraping under the surface would reveal this kind of guilt and a little bit of low self-esteem in relation to how well she was doing as a mother. And I don't think that's unusual either if you start to talk to people honestly. But again, that's down to the story. And especially for a mum or a dad who's maybe trying to balance home life, it's difficult to balance it all, but it's not helped by telling yourself that you're a crap mum or a crap dad at all. And society can put these kind of expectations on it if we're not careful and tell us, well, this is the way you should be, which is trying to inform your story. So we need to take control of our story, I guess is what I'm saying today. And at least go in and have a look at what's the story I'm telling myself. Now, if your narrative, if you're a narcissist, if your narrative is around thinking like, for example, well, I'm a winner. And I think there's kind of a common narrative around that. Well, like, let's think that you're a winner. But I think you have to be careful with that because you can kind of overdo that as well. And then start to look down on people, build up your ego too much. And I love that line. Somebody, I don't know who said it. It's like, don't look down on anyone But don't look up to anybody either. Just look at everybody the same level and get about your business. I also love the quote by C.S. Lewis, which is, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. There's a lot in that, a huge amount of profound wisdom. And for me, that's where we're looking to try and get this healthy, balanced self-esteem where there's humility, there's easy confidence, but it is confidence. It might be relaxed, but again, it's confident. And I wonder, can you relate to the fact that you are telling yourself a story? I mean, most of which are probably unconscious. I mean, you grew up in a country, there's stories attached to that country. I grew up in Ireland, there's stories attached to that country about our views on England, our views on America, views on what we're good at, what we're not good at. You know, there's a lot of stories attached to this. Some are really good, but some maybe not so healthy. Or as a child, maybe you feel, okay, well, I'm good at this, just like my client, or bad at this, like my client with maths. But again, do we ever challenge the stories, or do we just go, well, that's just the way I am? And you can't take on maybe every story, but certainly the ones that matter most. If you're trying to improve your results in a certain area of your work or your life, just check out and reflect on, what's the story I'm telling myself, and just see how it feeds into your self-esteem. Are you building overconfidence? Are you killing your confidence? Or do you have a nice Goldilocks version of just right confidence? And here's another thought for you. You know, what if we just dropped the story altogether? What if we weren't limited by whatever our story is? What if we just had nothing in the projector? That could be interesting. And that's certainly something that I'm very interested in. I wonder, could you consider that? So where do you think your self-esteem level is overall? I wonder, could you bring out your story into the light in relation to your work, where it is right now? What's your story? What's your self-esteem level? Do you see the link between the story and your self-esteem? And if the self-esteem is down, I wonder, could you change the story, or indeed could you drop the story that you're telling yourself? So the stories could be things like, well, I'm better than everyone else. Obviously, that's probably more narcissistic. I'm a victim. That could be narcissistic too. I'm a loser. I'm the man. I'm the woman. What is the story? I mean, there's thousands and thousands of variations. I mean, if your self-esteem is, if you're feeling low, maybe you could reflect on the story you're telling yourself and consider rewriting it again. If it's too high, if your self-esteem is too high, you'll probably be thinking of ways to ignore this podcast, perhaps. I leave that up to you. You'll probably be doing behavior that you know is wrong, and maybe you're taking a risk. I think if you're curious about it, maybe you'd ask somebody who you know will tell you the truth. But I think few, if they're really narcissistic, will probably even open themselves up to doing that. Maybe, I don't know, maybe someone would be the exception. And if you've got a nice, healthy self-esteem, maybe you can just reflect on the link to your story. But maybe you could also consider what an even better version of you looks and feels like. And maybe you could think bigger in certain contexts. Like, what does thinking bigger look like for you? If your self-esteem is high and in a solid place, maybe you could think bigger and more holistically, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. Because I think the world needs people we need people more who are in this kind of healthy self-esteem zone. And a really important variable that links to that is the story that we tell ourselves. So before I go, just a reminder of that survey and the link. It'll be in the links. And I'll leave you with this line. Just really consider creating a story that's worthy of your life. And consider every now and then maybe dropping your story completely and just see what happens. That's it for this week. Ciao for now.